I've been talking about the emotional fount of music and the reason for music, the way it taps in emotionally. But actually, in terms of the origin of music, there's another way of looking at it, and that is when we became bipedal, when our brains got bigger and we started walking on two legs rather than four. And one of the reasons for that that's suggested is that if you're on four, the sun goes down. If there's two legs and two legs, the sun makes you hotter all the way down there, so it needs a lot of bodily resources to be able to reduce the temperature. Whereas if you're standing upright, the sun's above in the savannah in Africa, the sun comes straight down. Yeah. And maybe that's why we've got hair on a head like this, because that's another temperature reducing device. Be that as it may, whatever the reason for it, it needed a lot of brain to do it. It must have been evolutionarily very advantageous, because it needs such a lot of brain to be able to go. Can you remember seeing a computer or robot that walks on two legs? You rarely see it. You don't. It's not designed as a household device because it's just too complex. Yeah. But we can do it easily, and we saunter along from one leg to another, enjoying ourselves. That's the key. We dance because we've got this amazing ability. We dance, and we love dancing, and we go from one to the other. So that's what happens in music. We yeah, and so music was, so often people say, is based on the dance, and even with a sad thing like that. I'm moving from one side to the other as I do it, and it sort of feels better in a way when I'm moving from one side to the other, because it just, and people can say, oh, rocking a baby to sleep. I think that's a kind of cul-de-sac. I think they've got it wrong by saying rocking baby to sleep, because it's very tempting to say rocking baby to sleep. But I think it's our rocking that it's good for us, because we go from one side to the other, and we like going from one side to the other. The baby doesn't care. He just gets to sleep. What are these people doing, rocking me? Just let me get to sleep. But if you're going from one side to the other, I think that is pleasant, and I think that is now how that taps in to the emotion. Don't know.
Yeah, no one really knows.
I'm not going to make up an answer to that because I simply don't know.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, I was wondering whether you could give us a few examples of some of your favourite pieces of music and talk about what characteristics they have in common that make them beautiful or moving.
Well, do you know, that's an extremely difficult question, because I so love music that I've just thought of that. I'm just going to think of things that happen to occur to me, because they're just hundreds of different things. What about, talking as we were about tragedies, what's the most ghastly tragedy that you know? Romeo and Juliet, surely. We've all seen Romeo and Juliet. We've all said, oh, if only. And we've used if only. And if only is the great tragic utterance, isn't it? Oh, if only. And it has a priest at the end, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Father, can't remember his name. So it starts with the Tchaikovsky setting of Romeo and Juliet, ballet Romeo and Juliet, which tells the story as a ballet. It starts, no, it's an overture, isn't it? It's symphonic, can't remember what it's called. Anyway, it's Tchaikovsky Romeo and Juliet, which tells the story. Brilliant. And it's this, 2 clarinets and 2 bassoons. Sorry. I'm going to do that again. then that's the opening, and then suddenly Tchaikovsky goes into the most imaginative, extraordinary, contorted kind of harmony, which expresses pure anguish. But that's a kind of funereal chant, which takes us right down to the very depths. And, in my view, springs us up as well. Music's no good if it leaves us in the depths. It's got to raise us up. And it's got this wonderful Tchaikovsky chord at the end, called a secondary seventh. And now, one thing you may say to me is, you say secondary seventh. Does it help you like music better to know that's a secondary seventh? Absolutely, it certainly does.
Yeah.
Now, you could say, okay, the people who don't know what these chords are they less well off? Yeah, they are. And part of musical education, introducing people to music, explaining why it's good, is showing them how to enjoy it better. And you can find out how to enjoy it better. I love knowing that that's a secondary seventh, because why should a secondary seventh have a particular effect? It's just called some clever label. But here's another one. Here's a really good example of that, actually. Now, when John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote that, they knew not a single term of music, except that that's an F major chord, that's some kind of seventh, that's an A major chord. They knew that. But what they had was the genius of the ear and the discerning musical brain, which they had to be able to say, wow, this is good. And they came up with it. And creativity in that way is quite astonishing, because I know they would have been very excited when they wrote that. They would have said, look what I've got. Now, knowing this moment in the Beatles' music, which I think is the most complete genius. I was chatting to, do you know Andy Staples? He's a tenor. Andrew Staples, professional tenor, was at Eton. And I said to him, do you know, I would love to meet Paul McCartney, if only to ask him who wrote that chord, the second chord in Yesterday. Because it's the secondary seventh in the relative minor, which instantly causes a modulation. Okay, now that's the... And you think, oh, clever clogs. You know, I love it for being that. Yeah. You know, and I explain it to everybody when I teach. I say, listen to this. It's a secondary seventh in the relative minor. It's the secondary seventh which leads to a modulation in the relative minor. And that's why it's so clever and so good. And every time I hear it, I think, oh, clever people, how wonderful. Andy Staples said to me, I met Paul McCartney last week, and I asked him that very question. I said, what? He said, yes. I said, who wrote the second chord in Yesterday? Was it your manager? Was it George Martin?
Yeah.
Or was it one of you? And Paul McCartney, and I said, what did he say? He said, we'd been writing lots of songs, because of course, you know, they wrote hundreds of songs before any that we know. They wrote loads and loads and rejected them, and then came up with things like She Loves You and From Me to You and things like that, which was suddenly very, very clever indeed. John came in one day and he said, this is Paul McCartney speaking, John came in one day and said, I've met this geezer over the other side of Liverpool who knows sevenths, and we don't do sevenths, we only do on straight chords. And so I'm off to see him. So he got on his bike with his guitar and off he went and saw this geezer that showed him how to write sevenths. So that meant, instead of that, just those, he could then do. Okay, big deal. So what? Muck about with them, play around with them, and you suddenly and you can suddenly do all sorts of nice things if you muck around with sevenths. And they would have played around with them, and then one of them would have been going like this, playing, and then he would have done. Oh! And it's only we coming along afterwards say, oh, that's the secondary seventh, you know, because it's a seventh in a minor. And that's extremely interesting because there's Paul McCartney and John Lennon, genius writers of music, knowing what should be and what works. And here's someone like me coming along and saying, oh yeah, that's a secondary seventh leading to a modulation into the minor.
So you would say, so what you're saying is, in your view, someone who's educated in music enjoys it more than someone who's not.
Yep, I would say that.
But would you say, because there's still an element because John Lennon and Paul McCartney learnt about seventh chords, but still didn't really know about them.
Yeah.
They were just
Yes.
messing about, really.
Yeah.
So, for the audience, if music and enjoyment is better when you're educated,
Yes.
but what about for creating the music?
Yeah.
You need to be educated.
They, as far as I'm concerned, they did know what a secondary seventh was. They just hadn't put those words to it.
Okay.
They knew. They said, oh, we do this, and then we do, oh, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.